Awesome. Hey, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a Sunday. Welcome to White Paper Circle, MEV in the context of PBS. Everybody ready to learn about MEV? Yes? Yes. Before we start, can we get a definition of what MEV is from anyone in the room? Okay, what was it before maximal extractable value? Minor. Yeah. Awesome. And what's PBS? Say that a little louder. Awesome. There we go. So today we're going to be talking about MEV in the context of PBS. So Ethereum is going to be moving to PBS soon, which is proposed to builder separation, proposed by the Ethereum Foundation, mainly led by Vitalik and a couple others. And then MEV is a concept which has really taken over the blockchain space over the past couple of years. So yeah, let's go ahead and dive right in. So a bit of an overview. So first we'll be diving into an intro to MEV. Then we're going to be talking about Flashbots. Oh, this ordering is a little bit off. It should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but it's okay. So we're gonna do intro to MEV, what is Flashbots, then MEV inside of PBS, PBS and L2s, then MEV redistribution, as well as the future of MEV after that. So what is MEV? MEV is the total amount of value that privileged parties can extract from the manipulation of transactions within a time frame which can be multiple blocks or across multiple domains. This typically includes including transactions, excluding transactions, or reordering transactions within a block. So at a high level, what this means is that you have these privileged parties within Ethereum and other blockchains that have the ability to reorder transactions. So within a block, people get transactions from mempool, and these transactions can be reordered in such a way where the proposer is able to maximize the amount of value they can extract, either by initiating contracts with people outside of the user submitting the transactions, or alternatively, just submitting those transactions themselves to gain, say, the arbitrage value out of it. So at a high level, just think about MEV as you have these privileged parties. They have additional capabilities that they can do within the system of a blockchain. And by manipulating the transactions, they can extract more value. Their goal is to be profit maximizing. So I love using the diagram of Cosmos, Tendermint, and ABCI as a good example for this. This basically shows at a high level what exactly a simple blockchain flow should look like. So on the top right here, we have the application logic, which flows via the application blockchain interface to the mempool, which is the place where all the transactions are being held. This then flows in between the proposer and the consensus logic to create a new block. Then after this block is delivered, you're able to move on into the next block of a blockchain. So the main thing we're focusing on today within MEV is this section on the left here. The most MEV is extracted in this interplay between the mempool and the consensus logic. So that's where we're going to focus today. Sound good? Yes? Awesome. Okay, so this is what MEV flows pre-Flashbots looked like on Ethereum. So what typically happens is that, oh, this is not showing up properly. Oh, there is. Okay, let me add them in real quick. Awesome. Have some people on Zoom too. If you guys have questions, just feel free to drop it in. We just started, Carol and Fiona. Awesome. So when we look at the flows of MEV pre-Flashbots, what we see is that we have about 6 different categories, right? So you have your users, which are the ones that are submitting the transactions to the mempool that we talked about in the earlier slide. We then have our searcher bots, which are the people that are picking up transactions and submitting them to these bundle pools. Essentially, these are pools of miners / validators that are bundling together transactions previously, or like using different ordering mechanisms on their own to extract MEV out of users. So what people will do is that these miners will join these bundle pools, right? So like there's specific kinds of like mining pools that will allow for the extraction of MEV pre-Flashbots. So they have the ability, because they're sophisticated, to reorder transactions. However, it's not evenly distributed, right? Individual miners need to join mining pools in order to get access to the ability to do MEV, which is a very centralizing force, because as soon as one mining pool group becomes stronger than the other ones, is more sophisticated, is able to extract more MEV, then a miner will just opt into that mining pool group, and it's very difficult to switch out of. So the optionality of choice is a lot harder than it is in a different system, because of the fact that you need to tie yourself into a mining pool group in order to get access to the MEV from that group.
Then a miner make MEV without being the miner?
They can, but the amount of resources for a small miner to be able to do that, say, for example, you're running an at-home Ethereum mining node, you're not gonna, it's not really profitable for you to be running the infrastructure necessary to detect all the arbitrage transactions on Ethereum that are there within the mempool, right? It's not very effective for you to do that. And so what people would do is they would go into these mining pools, which are more sophisticated organizations that can create better templates of blocks that then these miners can submit. Does that kind of make sense? Awesome. So as you can see, this is a very centralizing system and doesn't allow for much choice on behalf of the miners and validators, right? Which means that there are parties which are not really intended to be a part of this incentive alignment of Ethereum holding value in the system, which is not what we want. So this is kind of where it's important to separate the parties within the system. So when we take a look at the MEV supply chain, there's really 6 main groups that we're looking at. So the first is users, right? So these are people that are submitting transactions. This is where your order flow comes from, right? All the value in MEV only exists because users are submitting transactions. Without users, there's nothing, right? This is where all the MEV is deriving from. Wallets are the full nodes, say like your MetaMask that connects to an Ethereum node that are relaying the transactions of users to other systems. Then you have your searchers. These are the people that are identifying opportunities, say arbitrage transactions, and submitting them to builders who are building the blocks. Within MEV Boost, you have a system called relays. Relays take the blocks from builders and submit them to proposers, who then submit the blocks relayed to them for the rest of the Ethereum blockchain. See, essentially, they propagate that to everybody. So the validators are the proposers in the system.
So
go ahead.
This is with proof of stake and MEV Boost, right? The previous one was just in general, like when those proof of work for
yeah, MEV Boost launched post proof of stake.
But like this diagram is just this like slide is just for proof of stake.
I mean, you had builders pre proof of stake,
Yeah.
But you only had Flashbots as a builder. So you had one builder, but now you have multiple builders. So yes, they are different. Builders are the people that are constructing the blocks.
Right. I mean, like the actually like before PBS has been enjoyed.
No, they're not, because so Flashbots is not a validator on Ethereum.
Right.
So the question is like, are pre proof of stake were builders and proposers different? Yes, because Flashbots is like a decentralized organization, which I'll get into later, promised not to be a validator, right? And so like, again, these promises are very reliant on the trust and like authority and like reputation of the system. But like they operate as the sole builder in the system, who then would propose these blocks to anyone else. So like if you were running MEV Geth, which was the middleware that Flashbots was putting out, then you would have access to the blocks that the Flashbots builder is building. So then as a proposer, you run MEV Geth, and then you get access to those blocks. Exactly. And in this system, which I'll get into later, in MEV Boost, you have multiple builders. And then we'll look at what some of those trade-offs are of that space later on. So these are all the parties, but not all of these parties are privileged. So what I mean by that is users not really privileged in this system as of right now, right? There are obviously some things that users can do to be privileged, but really when you talk about the privileged parties in the system, the ones who are able to extract value, you're looking at the wallets, the searchers, the builders, and the proposers, because these are the, or actually, sorry, it's the wallets, builders, and proposers for the most part, because searchers are mostly acting in a competitive market. The wallets are the ones who get to decide where they send their builder flow. The builders are the ones who get to decide the inclusion and exclusion of transactions. So for example, if I don't want any of Sid's transactions to be included, and I know that one builder is the dominant builder, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pay Sean, the builder in the system, to not include Sid's transaction. And as long as what I pay Sean is more than the value of Sid's transaction will be excluded. So builders are proposed in the system, and then obviously proposers are the ones who should hold all the power, and that like they're the ones who get to choose which block they choose to propose. But this also is changing with time. But yes, these are the privileged parties in the system. It's mainly wallets, builders, and proposers. Yes.
Flashbots only puts out a relay to build blocks. One of the ones actually building the blocks.
Flashbots. I'm trying to remember. I think Flashbots does.
They do, but
They do both. I'm pretty sure they have a builder.
So other than
I'm trying, I think, I remember reading something about this and that like Flashbots does run a builder, right? Yeah,
so it, like you mentioned that building is a very centralized process. So
sure,
if Flashbots like the winner right now, right?
sure.
So if Flashbots just decided to censor it, is there? I would just have to do like a different building service
Sure, yeah.
to get my transaction completed.
So I will dive into this a little bit more later on, but basically validators in the current MEV Boost system opt into accepting blocks from relays, specific relays. So you'll pick whatever block a relay gives you, right? So depending on which relay you go to is the block that you'll get. You can opt in, I believe, into multiple relays, in which case you'd select the greatest block from that. And the reason why the system typically works in the long run is that, like, say, for example, you assume that Flashbots is getting 80% of the order flow. And there's another builder, say like a Manifold, that's getting 20% of the order flow. Even if on average, Flashbots average transaction is worth, say, like 0.1 ETH, and Manifold is worth 0.05 ETH, because there's a distribution of transactions, you can assume that over time, Manifold will only be proposing blocks with the highest value transactions in that distribution, right? And so over time, they'll eventually have a block that'll beat out the average Flashbots block, in which case Manifold will get a block included. So a bit probability intensive, but that's essentially why, like, it's not one, as long as you know that not 100% of the flow is going to one builder, there's always gonna be the potential for other builders to compete. But it's like an 80-20 block, right? Like it's a power law, right? Like essentially, as soon as you start getting more transactions, it compounds more and more and more and more. So centralized builders have a lot of issues, which we'll dive into more later.
And aren't there certain builders that are using like the Flashbots relay right now?
Yes, many builders use the Flashbots relay. I will show you a diagram with like that has all the builders using like these different relays. So
like
yeah.
Flashbots puts out a relay and they have their own builder.
Yes.
Okay.
That makes sense to everybody? Yes.
Like the relays before and after the.
I will get into that.
Okay.
Yeah. Awesome. So these are the privileged parties within the MEV supply chain. So oh, this is not included block. Okay, so sorry. Old slide. So in here we have a rough split of MEV. I'll divide it into two categories. There's obviously a lot more nuance to this, but in terms of what we consider good MEV and bad MEV, you can look at good MEV as being necessary to ensuring that the financial system is efficient, right? These are things that are not necessarily going to strictly negatively impact users. So as long as it is not strictly negatively impacting users, you can typically lump it in the good MEV category. However, things that strictly negatively impact users are lumped in the bad MEV category. So I'll talk about bad MEV first. You have things called generalized front runners, sandwiching, and censorship attacks. So generalized front running essentially is, say, for example, Sid submits a transaction, right? I'm a searcher, right? Someone who wants to take advantage of the fact that I know that Sid's transaction has some value inside of it. So what I'm going to do is I see Sid's transaction in the public mempool, and I'm going to simulate his transaction in a local copy that I have of the Ethereum blockchain on my own, say, infrastructure, right? I'm going to see what is the value of this transaction, and I'm going to submit a new transaction that pays the builder very small amount more than Sid's transaction. And so this works for any type of transaction. So it doesn't matter if Sid's doing a DEX trade, it doesn't matter if he's doing an NFT mint, as long as I know that I'm going to gain by front running Sid, I will front run Sid. So there's been, yes, you're a searcher. Searchers run generalized front runners. The infrastructure for this is like absolutely crazy. Like HFT firms run generalized front runners. Like you have like individual people, like crack people running generalized front runners. Like this is like, it's not necessarily the most profitable business because, as I mentioned earlier, searchers are not really a privileged party, right? Like, yeah, they really need to compete in this competitive market. So yeah, generalized front runners are really cool. I'll do sandwiching censorship attacks and I'll answer your questions. Yeah. So can anyone here describe to me what sandwiching is? What is sandwiching a transaction?
You put your transaction before and after. Like if I was searching and I knew you had a transaction,
Sure.
I could try to manipulate the transactions before and after it to extract value.
If you're buying a part of it.
So yeah, like increase liquidation, increase price impact.
Okay. And when I do a sandwich attack, what am I upper bounded by in terms of how much I'm able to sandwich you? Like, what is the bound on that? For example, say you're submitting a transaction, right? You're buying a shit ton of something, right? What gives me how much I can sandwich you up to when I locally simulate that in my system? Yeah. Slippage tolerance, right? Exactly. So the issue with DEXs often is that we see like users are not able to accurately estimate what their slippage is.
Yeah.
Because how you can think about it is, if there's not enough slippage, then there's not really an incentive for that transaction to get included, right? Because what you can think about is any additional more than market efficient slippage tolerance that you set will be sandwiched,
right,
if it's possible to sandwich in that system. Because I will take every like, for example, right? Like if you're really only going to face like 1.5% of slippage on like an ETH USDC trade,
Yeah.
right? Again, very high number. But I set a slippage tolerance of 5%. I will guarantee you will get slippage, like you will get sandwiched up to 5% if you submit to a public number.
Yeah.
So bad MEV, strictly negative impacts for users in the system. The third is censorship tax. So in the example I mentioned earlier, someone can pay a builder to not include your transaction, which results in a bad UX for you. So what are some examples of good MEV? Liquidations, arbitrage, and gas golfing. I think gas golfing is a little bit iffy on this, but gas golfing is a good external impact of the competitive searching market. So liquidations are important because you need to maintain the health of lending protocols. Liquidations are absolutely necessary to be able to do that. And effective searching markets allow for market efficiency in terms of these lending protocols. The second is arbitrage. You need to make sure that your DEXs are somewhat in line with SEX spot prices. And so arbitrage can be lumped under good MEV, as well as internal arbitrage from the DEX as well. And the last is gas golfing. Within the EVM, there's a lot of potential for gas efficiency to be made. And so as a result of a competitive searcher market, people have found very novel ways to do gas golfing, making, contract calls much more efficient than they used to be before.
What's the MEV for?
Okay, so the question was, what is the MEV for arbitrage? So for example, say there's an arbitrage opportunity between the spot price of ETH USDC on Uniswap versus Coinbase. What's going to happen is a bunch of searchers are going to submit transactions to be the ones to win that arbitrage. There's some value to doing that arbitrage, right? What you can assume is like 95% of that value is going to go towards the builder rather than the searcher. Because I'm paying essentially the proposer for the ability to do the arbitrage, right? So in that system, you now have an effective market for knowing, okay, if I win this builder, I can guarantee that I get this arbitrage opportunity. Whereas in another system, say where there's not really this effective builder market, I could tell a validator, hey, I'm going to pay you, but there's no way, like they could take my funds and it not be turned back in the system, if that makes sense. Like you'd pay them and there's no guarantee that you get the funds back. In this system, right, within like Flashbots, essentially what that enables is that like you only pay towards the proposer if the transaction goes through as a searcher, which is like essentially, does that kind of make sense why this benefits an arbitrage-based system? Or no? Okay.
Also, what if we get to the sandwiches? And the tax advantage, just
what are some examples of sandwich attacks that are not just Uniswap or DEXs? Let me think about this. Sandwiching. I think sandwiching is mostly DEX specific, but there is like front running, which I think falls into that category. Sandwiching means like you're going to front run and back run a transaction. So that's inherently like very related towards like prices or trades. But that's more just like front running a price oracle than it is like back, you know what I mean? Like you're going, that an update for a price oracle is going to happen. And so what you do is like, you're going to bundle this transaction that right after the price oracle, I want to submit this transaction that say like liquidate someone, right? So you're like combining your, like that's not really sandwiching, if that makes sense. Like like the bad part about sandwiching is less of the part where you back run someone and more about the part where you front run someone and then back run them on the thing that you front run them on.
and the background is mostly just you like paying that.
It's you arbitraging it back towards normal value. Because essentially what they're doing is you front run a little bit such that like, because of the way that like Uniswap's like XY equals K curve is set up, I'm going to front run it to the point where there's no liquidity in the market. And then you're going to spike the price a lot. And then I'm going to back run the shit out of you so that like on the way down, I'm making all the money. So I'm just, for every part of capital that I'm putting in, I'm getting more output from you for doing the front running.
Well, this is so frustrating, but I'm never actually looking to work out things on it, but how do you start things? So is it liquidity for capital coming from the worst these from?
Liquidity for flash loans, I believe, can come from, it comes from money markets for the most part. Yeah, Aave, and there's a couple other sources of flash loans as well.
But you're always gonna have like, the more liquidity the better. Okay, that's what you just, like, this is how like, the agreement is like, the amount of profit, right? So it's like, you can't rely on sufficient liquidity to try to make,
It's less about the amount of liquidity and more about the inefficiency and how people set their slippage tolerances for sandwiching, and also the ability for people to sandwich in the first place, right? Like if a builder refuses to accept front running transactions, then you don't have sandwiching, right? Sandwiching can exist if builders refuse to accept front running transactions. It's like within the United States, front running is illegal. Like you're not allowed to front run people on stock markets. And so what you can imagine is the same way that the US regulated tornado cash, front running can also be regulated in that they can say, okay, builders, if you accept front running transactions, you're in violation of Department of Treasury laws. So it's more of a legal regulation to ensure that there's no strictly negative bad impacts on users as a result of surging markets. Does that make sense? For like how front running can be like talked about? Yes? Okay.
Everyone's here where builders can still create stuff running transactions, they just will have to accept them. Like PBS still are technically front.
PGAs are still technically front
And you can front run transaction
by paying more gas. Sure. Yeah.
And same, which means
But it's more about the. Yeah, I see what you mean in terms of that. But like, it's more about the atomicity of it that exists in the Flashbots. Like PGAs is like kind of like there's like this like probabilistic gray area of like, okay, like yes, like I submitted a PGA with like one gas higher, but like what guarantees that the builder is going to accept my PGA front run before someone else's PGA front, right? Like I could just say, oh, I dropped your transaction that was one gas higher. So.
Can you talk about how like batch execution actually didn't block, like for example, like this is different in the sense that like for example, like the number of executes all the transactions at once. That's distributed.
Sure.
Is that like
Batch execution? Are you talking about specifically within the context of a DEX?
Yeah.
Like what's the question there? Like how that works?
like how like I don't. For example, it's a shitty deck. There's no way for you to know what's happening. Maybe see transactions.
Sure.
So, like, if I get down, so right now, let's see how we're gonna have like batch. Like, let's say also this is a batch.
Sure.
Is there any
Potential for MEV?
Yeah,
there is
potential
potential for MEV. So here's the as long as I like. You can assume there's no MEV if your system is completely, it's in a vacuum, right? But if I somehow am able to get, you're assuming, is this an encrypted as well as, okay, if it's a non-encrypted environment, I see that massive trades are happening, right? So what I'm gonna do is, I know that this DEX price, spot price is gonna jump up this way, and it's gonna go out of line with this X price. So what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna back run this DEX.
on the next block or the same thing?
Does that matter?
It's happening. Like the batch execution happens at the end of the block.
Yeah.
Are you batching both ways? You have to batch both ways. You have to batch both ways. Like, as in, like, are you matching flows? So how, like, batch execution can work for the number, like, for a bit of context for people on the call, this is talking about like batch execution of decentralized exchanges. So like whenever within a specific pair, you're going to execute all trades within a pair at the same price. What I mean by matching flows is, for example, if you want to trade 100 of, ETH to USDC this way, and then I want to trade 200 of USDC to ETH, you're going to match the 100, and then you're only going to batch execute this 100 ETH to USDC at whatever price this moves to.
Right.
And then you're going to give everyone that equivalent price.
Yes.
Okay, and that system, it's a bit tougher, but there is an example of this. I will look it up after. I was like looking at this a lot over the summer. So I think there is an example of this where you can do it, but it's more about like it depends on how much liquidity the system has. You can also be the person to back run it on. If like say the DEX has enough liquidity, if the DEX is the big partner, then what you're gonna do is you're gonna back run on the SEX. Does that make sense?
So. I just don't. I don't think
As long as there is some difference between your local market price and the global market price, there is a potential for some form of MEV.
But when you see that difference, right?
Sure,
You have to see when the transaction and execute in the next one,
sure.
and you don't know what the state will be on the next for all the batch executions for the next one.
Oh, like, there could be other transactions.
Yeah, there could be other transactions.
I mean, if the opportunity is big enough, you could pay the proposer not to include any other transactions. So like there are nuances to the system that allow you to do it, if that makes sense. Like I can eliminate, and it's not even, I have to even eliminate all the DEX trades. I just have to eliminate all the trades in my pair.
Right.
So, yeah.
And it's not always assume no heat and maybe on the nurses, since everyone's proposing like get rid of it or have to just aggregate it all.
That there is MEV on layer 2s or there's not. There's a lot of MEV on layer 2s because of the fact that you essentially have like sequencers are incredibly sophisticated and centralized. And
End of the day, it also has like one.
but like, for example, if you had like a perpetual trading platform
Mhm.
on a layer 2, right? And that perpetual trading platform is relying on some information from another L2, or even within that L2, there's like different platforms that have different prices. There's still MEV that's available. If there's 2 perpetual trading platforms on an L2, there's still arbitrage to happen between it. And so there's some privileged party that needs to facilitate that MEV. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's not just there will be more opportunities, it's not going to find.
Exactly. And the really interesting part about MEV on L2s is less of, okay, like there are some similarities to MEV on L1 to MEV on L2. It's more about what can I do with MEV across multiple domains? And what can I do with MEV with like an extremely sophisticated sequencer, right? Like if, for example, the party that's ordering the transactions is very sophisticated, you can separate things like block ordering and block execution, like transaction ordering and transaction execution. And I can auction off, like there's this whole thing on Optimism where they were trying to auction off the ability for people to order the blocks for the sequencer. And then that revenue would get internalized to holders like the OP token or like the sequencer itself, essentially providing incentive for the sequencer to be run. Not less of PBS and more of like in the role of an all-powerful proposer, what are the different functions that a proposer takes on? And can you get revenue out of separating those opportunities? So there's like proposers are responsible for proposing the block execution as well as ordering the block. If I can just auction off ordering the block after I've decided which transactions I want to include, you can do that. Whereas like builders, proposer builder separation is the ordering and the inclusion falls on the builder. So you have like inclusion, you have the ordering, and then you have the execution. Does that make sense?
I mean, the inclusion part is depending on the design, right? Because you could, in order to like, try to prevent censorship
Resistant lists, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, like that, what I'm saying is those are 3 big axes of design space that you can operate in.
so for the music, or in general, I'm trying to think of like the algorithms and like how energy is sort of for.
Sure. Sure. So this is a bit informed from like some context on like builders within Cosmos, where you have like a lot more, because you have a smaller set of transactions and a smaller set of validators, there's more optimal outcomes you can essentially reach in terms of the ordering and inclusion of transactions. What I mean by that is that like, I'll probably, if we have some time, I'll show you guys like how like bundles work in Ethereum, but essentially like what you're doing is a bunch of people are competing for a bunch of different opportunities, right? But there's like some set of like N bundles that are proposed that are interacting with like different sets of resources, right? Interleaving those resources is where the optimization battle begins, right? So you have from the time at which a set of bundles is submitted to the point at which you have to propose a block to the proposer as the builder, you have like less than like, say like 5 seconds, right? Honestly, less than like 2 seconds when you consider the fact that you need to receive all the possible transactions first. And then you also need to communicate it and they have to go through consensus. So you're looking at time about like 1 second, right? To determine what the precise ordering of bundles in this transaction is, or within this block is. And so there's like different algorithms for determining how do I interleave these bundles the best, which bundles of transactions do I include, which ones do I drop? And so like, there's a lot of algorithms that go into that. There's no like running the optimal, like say like complex solutions to the problem is very difficult. I don't think it's been formulated yet. So
when you say bundles, you're referring to like,
yes, yes, like everything in Flashbots in the Flashbot system can be considered as like a bundle, right? I'm submitting some combination transactions that is greater than or equal to 1 transaction that I want to be executed atomically, right? So like I only want, for example, you submit a transaction to, we'll take the sandwiching example, right? You submit a transaction to Uniswap to do the ETH-USDC trade. I'm going to front run your trade and back run your trade, but I only want that to execute together, right? I don't want just your trade to execute. I don't want just my front run to execute or just my back run to execute, right? I only want it all to execute together. So I'm going to take those transactions, your public transaction, and then my 2, we'll call them private transactions that I'm submitting to the builder, and we're going to bundle them together. And then Flashbots will only include those as a bundle, right, together, placed in between other bundles, based on how much I'm going to give to, say, the proposer or the builder. Does that make sense? Yes.
Yeah. And the ordering for this itself.
Yes, and which bundles to include, right? Because for example, if you submit like say, for example, someone has like a really complicated bundle that like does a liquidation, then does a front run, then does a back run, then does like a price update, then does another back run. That's now 3 different resources, right? I'm using your DEX trade, a liquidation, and a price update in the same bundle. And so that means that other bundles must get excluded as a result. And also, I need to ensure that my bundle gets placed first. So now you're excluding another set of bundles which can't get included, right? And the builder has to calculate what are the optimal inclusion of bundles. It's a very like expensive process.
They also have to basically like bundle to see it though.
Yep, that's simulated too. So first, you need to simulate all of it.
Yeah.
Then need to decide which ones to include, then have to decide the ordering, then have to broadcast it, all in less than a second. So it's hard to reach an optimal outcome. So that's where the cool algorithm stuff is. Searchers create bundles, builders decide which bundles get included. I'm gonna move on, but we'll talk. Yes. No, hard for the builders, which is why there's no like optimal builder. There's only like really, really good builders. Right? Like commitment of it. But then the issue is, then you have to force some kind of like a bond mechanism. So the question was like, how do you incentivize searchers to actually broadcast what the value of their bundle is? They're obviously going to broadcast it, but in order to hold them accountable, you have to be able to slash them in the case of something goes bad. Yeah, but like it's a bit difficult. I don't know. Yeah. So, but yeah, we'll move on. So again, we talked about the sandwich attack, talked about this honestly in a lot of depth, but basically like what you're looking at is like a front run, then a back run of a transaction that's in the public mempool. A cool side note here before we dive into other sections is there's also baiting sandwichers. So like, as you guys can see, searchers, right, are extremely cutthroat, right? They will sandwich you to the absolute maximum of your slippage tolerance. But because I know the searchers are efficient and because I know that they're running really, really fast, trying to run extremely competitive markets, what I can do is there is this like this contract that got deployed called Salmonella, that was essentially like a poisoned ERC-20 contract, which when simulated with a specific, basically like they did this thing where like when a searcher simulated the transaction within their local infrastructure, it worked, but whenever they submitted the transaction to Flashbots, the funds that they thought they would be getting out of it would actually instead be going to the person that deployed the token contract. Because they essentially like poisoned the ERC-20 such that like when it was given, I believe, a specific sender address being like the Flashbots bundle, like the Flashbots like executor would transfer all the funds to the creator of the token contract. So because people know that searchers are operating extremely efficiently, there's been a lot of like crazy things happening, like the dark forest of MEV for it. So yeah, that's little taste of what we're gonna get into. But yeah, so a lot of cool back and forth within MEV that is very interesting to explore. But let's go ahead and dive into the next section. Any questions before we dive in about like what MEV is? Everyone kind of have a good understanding of like how MEV kind of looks like at a top, like at a high level, like what the parties are. Yes? Any questions?
One thing is like, if searches, searching like something that is such a competitive market, like why doesn't it just say really know like value for searches?
Why does it not converge to an extremely low value for searchers?
Yeah.
It does. Like I've seen, and Sean probably can talk about this a little bit, but like people will go like ballistic over their searcher getting like 5 cents on an arbitrage trade,
Right.
which is not worth the time that they put in,
Yeah.
right? Exactly, right? Like you're having a good time because of how hard the problem is, but it's not necessarily extremely competitive. Whereas the privileged parties in the system are making a lot, or at least volume slowing down, are making a lot of money, which is why it was so lucrative. Obviously, searcher markets in the beginning were lucrative, but because they don't really have a privileged position, they lose a lot of that value as time goes on without aligning themselves with the validator of some form.
Is there centralization within searchers? Because like, if you're.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. Power law. Yeah.
So,
Like certain searchers are getting like $1.8 million in returns, and other ones are getting like 2 cents or like losing money.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's the searchers that are like losing $100,000 on like poison ERC-20s, and other ones that are making like $2 million on other things, right?
Yeah.
So, and there's like searchers, they'll get like hacked because they deploy like different contracts. It's like a whole mess, right? But searcher market is extremely competitive, but it's also follows the power law in a similar degree. But like the power law of centralizing searchers is not as bad for the system as centralized builders. Okay, so what is Flashbots? How many people here have heard of Flashbots before? Good, awesome. We got the whole room, not bad. So Ethereum is what is this? Oh yes, this is the Georgios post. So Ethereum is Dark Forest essentially was this big post put out by Georgios back in 2020 that was talking about how crazy generalized front runners were back then. They were essentially trying to like save funds from a contract that was going to get exploited, but they needed to like work with like different validators in order to ensure their transaction got included. So this is like pre-Flashbots, right? You're looking at like a very wonky marketplace for ensuring that certain transactions get included. And so it was really, I think, what's the word for this? Like it was like a precursor to all the development and the crazy rise of like focus on MEV during 2020 and 2021, which I think like was really pushed forward by these kinds of like major posts that were detailing how exactly MEV is possible. So, it started out with just like talking about like how important it is in order to be able to like say like save funds from a contract that is going to get exploited to every single transaction being involved in MEV in some form. So yeah. So the history of Flashbots, a good paper was put out in 2019 called Flashbots 2.0, basically gave a big formalization of like the craziness that was to come of all the MEV that was happening on like DEXs, as well as just like how like front running, like transaction ordering, all that different stuff worked. So like most blockchain systems start with, well, we'll dive into like the flow of how exactly like transaction ordering, as well as like MEV at a blockchain level worked. But essentially, most blockchains, and you can see this even on Cosmos chains today, start with first come, first serve ordering within blocks for validators. Basically, like validators will just include transactions in the order in which they receive them. Obviously, like this system is not very conducive to being able to get efficient markets, right? Because like certain transactions are worth more than others. And people do want to pay to ensure their transactions are included before other transactions in the block. And also first come, first serve ordering is also not conducive towards like optimal game theory of like how exactly blocks should be ordered. So what came after that was PGA auctions on Ethereum. So you have these priority gas auctions. Essentially, people would bid a certain amount of gas in order to be able to include their transaction in a certain position within the block. The issue that came with this, though, is that you essentially have like bad UX that came out of it. And that, for example, Sid submits a transaction with 45 gas, right? That is extremely valuable, right? But I, as the searcher, want to make sure that no one else is able to take advantage of this opportunity or even do anything else in the block. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to submit one transaction that has 46 gas, right? One more gas than Sid's transaction. And then I'm going to fill up the rest of the block with a bunch of empty transactions that take 44 gas. And so now no one else is able to submit a transaction, but I guarantee that I get the MEV. So it's not a very efficient system, but that essentially was the only way that you could guarantee that you would get access to the system in that way. So all those other people who submitted, say like Uniswap trades with 30 gas were no longer able to execute the transactions, which kind of sucked. So after that, you had EIP 1559, which started this thing called like a base fee, as well as a proposer payment. Basically, you would pay a base fee in order to be able to submit a transaction on Ethereum, and then you'd pay a specific fee towards the person that would be proposing the block. This allowed for more stability within the prices of gas within markets. Along with this kind of came like the Flashbots single builder, so single relay. Essentially what that means is that like Flashbots was operating started operating in builder transactions. So at first they would accept one bundle of block, right? And they would only submit that bundle at the top of the block for all validators running MEV Geth middleware. Then after that, they expanded to multiple builders submitting to a single relay that would all compete in an MEV auction. Essentially, Flashbots is determining which bundles get included by how much they're paying to proposers, right? So that's essentially how that auction works. And then if like the simple version of that auction was, I'm going to bid to use this resource, I'm going to pay this amount. If I win it, no one else can use that resource for the rest of the block. Resource being a transaction in the public mempool. Yes. So
How is EIP 1559 was for gas stability, right?
yes.
Yeah. How is that?
MEV?
Yeah.
Good question. So basically, EIP 1559 like gave this separation of like, what is the fee that's specifically for inclusion within the block? And then what is the fee that's going on top of that towards the proposer for the specific transaction? So the base fee is for the smoothing of the price that like users will pay in order to get their transactions included. And then the proposer fee, I'm forgetting what the name, Coinbase essentially is what it's called on the block itself, like the Coinbase fee, is the amount that you pay the proposer in order to get your transaction included. After that came MEV Boost, which I'll get into a little later. And then after MEV Boost is proposer builder separation, which was talked about last week, but then I'll talk about a little bit later on as well.
How does Flashbots MEV auction different from PGA?
PGAs like meant that like people say would be getting bad UX and that they would submit a bunch of other transactions in order to exclude everyone else. In this system, you can guarantee that you get it by just paying the specific amount for bundling the transactions. So instead of trying to say like bundle a transaction by paying +1 gas and -1 gas, I'm instead just going to say, I just want to include this transaction. I'm going to pay you this amount to include these transactions in specific ordering. Does that make sense? Exactly. So it's better for builders, right? Because they are now able to better evaluate the value of bundles without having to worry about like this like these weird things of like trying to prevent people from like submitting a bunch of like empty transactions, right? There's not really incentive to do that as much or within a bundle-based system.
And the builder is different than MEV Boost, right? Or does the MEV Boost also have an option mechanisms?
MEV Boost also has an auction mechanism, but like each builder can run their own auction mechanism. Like this is the benefits of the like how each builder distinguishes themselves is in the order flow that they have and the auction that they run. If you create a better auction, you can create more value for proposers. Right?
And if you design a bad auction,
Uh-huh.
is it possible to exploit the builder to extract MEV out of the builder? Or like reduce?
If you design a bad auction, what do you mean?
So like, for example, like the builder also wants to maximize the MEV that they get out of the bundle. Yeah. Right? Actually, let's use that.
If a builder has a bad auction, they will never win a block.
Yeah. Is the proposal is taken out of them?
That has a higher fee paid to them. Like bad auction inherently means that they're not getting as much value out of the auction as they should.
Yes.
So then why as a proposer would I take a block from a bad auction rather than a good auction that's going to pay me more? Builders only have value because proposers accept their blocks.
What is the auction through?
The auction is determining which bundles get included. So in the proposer wouldn't care enough as long as they get behind it. But why would the builder pay? Like where is the fee coming from? It comes from what we consider to be the
bad valuation of your bundle. Like your bundle is a lot more valuable than you think it is. You're
sure.
still gonna pay a fee, but you're losing out on value that you could be extracting.
I'm confused. What like what is the question here? Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, if you get back to your question, but like, what I mean by auction is you have like these searchers that are submitting bundles. Builder here is running an auction, right? That auction is what determines which bundles get included, which then gives you the value that you're going to pass on through the relay to the validator. Does that make sense?
Does the auction also determine sequencing or is it just?
Ordering, yes. Because, for example, like in this auction, I will need like someone wants to make sure that their transaction comes first.
Right.
Some people are less, and some bundles care less about the ordering.
Yeah.
So they'll get placed second. So the auction implicitly determines the ordering based on the value that gets created out of specific people being able to put their bundles in.
Right.
Does that make sense?
So then how do you guarantee? Isn't an option like fundamentally like someone can always outbid you? Like how do you guarantee
How do you guarantee that what?
that like oh, your model design this solution and not?
Well, the only way, because you add a condition saying that like, I don't want you to include this specific transaction unless you put it at this specific place.
Oh,
Does that make
yeah,
sense?
yeah,
And you encode that within your transaction as well.
right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But and by the way, you encode, but like what I mean by placed first is the first person to use a specific resource.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because like if other people use resources before me, I don't care.
Yeah, that would be fine.
But as long as I get my own resource, I'm gonna say like, okay, as long as the price within this DEX is what I want it to be, I execute my transaction. Otherwise, my transaction will fail. Okay, so basically, this is like the high level of what MEV Boost looks like. So you have searchers as well as private order flow, which I'll dive into a little bit later. Submitting to builders. Builders then will connect to a relay. The relay is trusted by the validator to submit a good block to them. So in this system, relays are trusted. They need to be able to evaluate that blocks are good from builders because validators blindly accept blocks from relays. And we'll dive into what actually came out of that, which is that a relay was messing up their calculation for the value of blocks like 2 weeks ago. And for 4 hours, blocks that were like really actually like not giving that much value to validators were getting accepted blindly because the relay was calculating them poorly. So it actually has had bad impacts on the Ethereum network because of it. But does this high level make sense? Basically what can happen, right, is that like good transactions are no longer getting included. Because what that person was doing is to exploit the relay to exploit the relay. They were submitting blocks with a bunch of empty transactions that had like some like arbitrary call data that then the relay would evaluate as, oh, they're actually giving me 10 ETH per transaction when they weren't, right? Meaning that like other transactions that had value were not getting included. But like, what I mean is bad for the network is something that is not profit maximizing for the validator, because that inherently breaks down the assumptions of why validators are running their validator. Does that make sense? Like validators are supposed to be as profit maximizing as possible, because if they're not, then the system is imbalanced in the way that it works.
So does every proposer just take
A relay takes that
a
from.
relay or a set of relays or some like middleware to just accept blocks from, and then run their own like, oh, this like relay, like with my set of relays, this is the one that I'm paying the most, and then just take that and submit.
That's what I think. I think you can connect to multiple relays.
So you would just like take the max of all of them and take submit that.
Yep. Yep.
What's the incentive for viewers?
They're not. They're really incentive right now. Yeah, that's the issue. So like all these relays, like here's the thing though, is like if you want to ensure that like your blocks are getting included, like if you're on block builder, like relays will be different because like different organizations will run them, and then also some relays are censored relays and some relays are uncensored relays. I'll dive into what that means later on. But basically, like some transactions get censored in some relays, say Tornado Cash transactions, and in other relays, transactions are uncensored, so anyone can submit.
What is the difference in MEV Boost and relay? Like what is the role of,
What is that?
yeah,
What is MEV Boost?
yeah, what is the, because the relay is just like taking several builders, and then
MEV Boost takes it, moves it from one relay to multiple relays in the system. Relays submit different, they have different kinds of blocks they're submitting basically.
so MEV Boost is also centralized.
Centralized in terms of trusted, you need to trust the relay, yes, but now there's multiple relays rather than just Flashbots.
So what's the point of any?
The point of the MEV Boost is so that you get diversity in terms of the kinds of transactions that are included, because Flashbots is a US organization.
Yeah.
So they can get sanctioned for submitting, say, Tornado Cash transactions. And so in order to ensure the neutrality of Ethereum, you need to have multiple relays that have different kinds of transactions they can include. And additionally, relays accept from builders, right?
Yeah.
You can say that validators are geographically distributed,
Yeah.
right? And if validators are geographically distributed, what that means is that there's going to be some latency in terms of like when builders are able to submit to specific relays. By distributing the number of relays, you also ensure the uptime of the system is greater, right? You're just essentially making the system more resistant to failures,
Okay, so if I.
and you get diversity.
So if I understand correctly, proposers use MEV Boost to get access to several relays.
Yes,
And then pick the one block that they.
from the relays they're connected to that has the most value for them. Yes. So in terms of the flow, searchers and order flow seem to make sense to everybody. You're submitting to a builder. Builders are connected to one relay, right? So I'll show this, there's a really cool website that you guys should look at after this. I'll show it during this as well, that shows like which builders are connected to which relays. Now there's multiple relays within the MEV Boost, as you can see here, like with the little cards. Then it gets routed to the MEV Boost client, then to the consensus client of the validator, which then is accepting the block that pays them the most from the relays they're connected to. That makes sense? Yes?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Flashbots.
Flashbots is a builder and a relay.
Oh, cool.
So here we go.
I have a question.
Oh, yes. What's up, Fiona?
Do builders profit from this process, and how do they profit?
Builders profit from this process, and how do they profit from this process? So basically what builders are doing, right, is just ensuring that as long as they're paying their proposer more than any other block other builders create, they can keep track of all the other profits. They can take all the other profits from that block. right? So for example, in this system, if I have a block that is going to give, that has 1/8 of value, right? That like is being paid to some mix of the builder and the proposer. And the next highest block that anyone else has is 0.5 ETH. What I can do is I can say, okay, I'm going to pay the proposer 0.51 ETH, and I'm going to take 0.49 ETH. Does that make sense? So the builder makes however much is greater than the second highest builder in the market, because only one builder's block can win at any given point in time, right? If only one builder's block can win, then your profit is everything greater than the second highest valued block that's out there. Does that make sense, Fiona?
Gotcha. So they just like split the pie, kind of.
Pretty much, yes. But you don't really know how much other blocks have, I think, at least. Right? And so it's an estimation process, right? You're estimating like how much you can take and still win at the same time.
I see. Thank you.
Yep. Awesome. So two somewhat heavy diagrams here, but basically on the left, on your right, on your left, you had the relays on Ethereum. So you have Flashbots, Bloxroute, Eden, Block Native, and Manifold are basically like the four big groups that are running relays on Ethereum. I think there's some more ones that are coming out. As you can see though, Flashbots in this top right diagram proposes more than 80% of MEV Boost blocks.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that are getting all the flow from searchers, right? The best searchers are connected to Flashbots because Flashbots is the builder that's most likely to win. So as you can see, very power law-esque, right? They control 80% because of the fact that they're well trusted. They're the ones who made the system, but there's still competition in the market, right? Because some searchers say are more geographically located towards Bloxroute, or alternatively, Bloxroute max profit is accepting non-censored transactions. So your Tornado Cash transactions that have value are the ones that are getting censored again. Does that make sense? And other censored transactions as well. Say, for example, there's like 40 or 50 Ethereum addresses that are on the SDN list, the specially designated nationals list. And so like those transactions from those addresses are likely included in the Bloxroute max profit blocks, because they basically place that outside of the geographic jurisdiction of the US and its allies. So lots of politics go into this as well. Additionally, as you can see the block values of the different blocks in Ethereum. So like on average here, you see that like Flashbots is making 0.146 block value per ETH. Bloxroute max profit is making about 0.11. So like on average, Flashbots is obviously paying more out, but whenever a Flashbots block has less than the 0.11, then likely a Bloxroute max profit block is going through. Does that kind of make sense? Yes?
Yeah.
Awesome. So in terms of the share of total block building, this number is a bit outdated. This is from September 18th. I think this number is closer to around like 70% now of all blocks in Ethereum are MEV Boost blocks. And obviously Flashbots is absolutely dominating that. In the bottom right, we also have an average gas use per block. So what builders will do is they're trying to optimize the amount of gas used per block such that like they can shorten that number, make that number smaller so that they can take more of the payment from the block. That they can reorder the transaction such that there's less gas used while it's maximizing the amount of profit. You have more space to take that. Does that kind of make sense?
And then you would just say the public good, or they will fit.
Is MEV Boost a public good? I think it falls into a greater question of like, is Flashbots a public good? I think they like to think that they are. And I like to think that they are as well, but it's a fine line to toe when you're running your own relay and builder. I'll show you guys the website real quick too. Yeah, what's up?
You mentioned
Geographically distributed, yes.
So how does that affect latency? Does latency and the effect on blocks?
So think about it this way, right? So when we were talking about like the optimal block construction, right? You have about 1 second to do that. The speed of light is what, 186,000 miles a second? Is that about right? Yeah. Yeah, 186,000 miles a second, right? It's, I think, the like approximate number for that. So the Earth is 25,000 miles in circumference, like some number like that. So we'll say it's like something like that, right? This is like some number of play on mass. I'm pretty sure it's like somewhere right. So at that number, it takes about 160 milliseconds to send a message at the speed of light around the world.
There's no way you did that.
I've done it before. I've done it.
Okay.
And then 160 milliseconds to send it back.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, you're looking at like a fourth of a second in order to do that. And that's not even including the processing time on both sides to be able to receive the transaction, which can likely be in the range of like tens of milliseconds, right? So you're shortening your ability if you're transmitting to a builder on the other side of the world to include transactions by 25 to 30%. So you're looking at outcomes that are likely less optimal than if your builder is right next to you.
I guess this is the case, but it was validated for like the US, for example, right?
It's different. Yep.
Then it's kind of hard to get a relay that isn't the US, so 400.
Oh, yeah. There'd be no point in running it because like all these other people are going to submit to it. So like a good example of this is Say Network, which is launching like a centralized Say Network, SCI network. Yes, DEX on Cosmos. They're basically like all located within the US and Europe, like all their validators. And so what that means is they can have 400 millisecond block times because the time to transmit messages is less than like, 20, 30 milliseconds between all their validators. So because their validators are geographically co-located, that means that they're able to have extremely low block times. Does that make sense? Because if you can get messages between 2/3 of your validators within 100 milliseconds, your block times can be extremely low. Like it's all bounded by the speed of light, which is really interesting. So, yeah. Does that make sense? So, awesome.
Okay. So would it just make sense to just search for MEV, like have your server that's searching for MEV just right next to a validator?
Yep. As Sean can tell you, you want to be co-located next to a validator. As a server.
What about like multiple goals contribute? Like it takes time to go like stuff like transaction to the example, like this person.
Yeah.
Yep. Like doesn't that mean like
Your block times get longer as your validator set gets more distributed.
Like, doesn't that mean like certain relays are not limited, but like see like more, or like only see like a certain subset of handful transactions to like.
Sure. Like here's the thing, they'll see all of them, right? But it's just like how fast they'll see them and how fast they can decide whether to include them or not. Because for example, if I have 1 second to construct my block, I'm also not sure if that number is exactly right, but like just based off like rough estimation, that seems like an about right number for it. So if you have 1 second to construct my block, I receive your transaction 600 milliseconds in. Am I really going to spend the time to simulate your transaction? And then if I have to replace a bunch of other transactions, figure out what else downstream I need to replace, and then multiply that by 100 transactions I received, right? 600 milliseconds in my block. I'm just going to wait to the next block, in which case your opportunity is likely to be gone.
So you see like, you see like certain transactions only being added into MEV bundles within certain areas, like the areas that they're.
Yeah, sometimes, but it's not, it's like, yes, but like, I think it's more interesting to look at like, you see this more pop up in terms of like private order flow than you do in terms of like geographic distribution of like where transactions originate from, if that makes sense. We'll talk about private order flow later and that makes more sense. So yes, there's a small correlation, but like you can assume that like, it's not terribly significant where it impacts everything. But you like as a searcher, you want to be located right next to your validator so that like your validator is receiving all your transactions right when they're looking at the block. Because that you're making their life easy, so they're more likely to include your transactions.
Just like one smaller question. Would it make sense to have a strategy where you have your node, or one of your nodes searching an example like far away from validators or like far away from other searchers and like their mempool, or like what transactions they're doing? Like basically like
You just want to be where like the most order flow is, right? Like I just want to be able to access like what I mean by like validators are the ones who are hosting their local versions of mempools. So like when Sid was talking about DAG BFTs, right? Like each validator has their own local version of mempool. All the transactions in the public mempool that they've received. The state of the public mempool is not the same across the board for all validators. So you cannot access the state of a mempool without being able to connect to a validator because users are not submitting transactions to you, the searcher, unless you're running a full node as well. So if you're not running a full node, as in you're not receiving the propagation of transactions, you need to be co-located next to a validator so that you can query the state of the mempool.
Wait, so if you have a full node though.
Yes, then you're essentially,
Other nodes are closest to any transaction.
Exactly.
It doesn't have to come to that.
sure. So you can run your own full node then, but think about like on Avalanche, it takes you like $250,000 to be able to run a full node, or maybe 2.5 million.
30K now.
Oh, okay. But like back when the market was like way up, it was like 250K to run that. So as an individual person, 250K on 5 cents in arbitrage transaction just does not work in the long run, right? Which is why you see searchers coalesce into these larger organizations that have more capital. Like MEV shops exist because you need crazy infrastructure in order to be able to run it. So, yeah.
So for searchers, you want to be close to a validator to get the state of the but with PBS, it wouldn't really matter for them accepting the transactions. We need to the right bundle, from the right builders, the right relay, high speed, all that.
You still want to be co-located next to the validator though.
How does that?
I still need to be able to access the public mempool.
That's what I'm saying. It only helps for this like accessing the mempool, but like beyond that, everything else is just like with PBS, it abstracts away the part like you just like directly send your transaction to value like hey, PBS.
Okay, but think about it this way, right? Where does all the value of MEV derive from? Users.
Yeah.
So yes, like you are submitting to a builder, but you still need to be co-located next to that validator, but you also now want to be close to that builder as well. So now you just have more complex infrastructure as a searcher in PBS.
You also want to push it.
I mean, yeah, because you want to be able to submit your transactions to the builder quickly. Because if you have a lot of latency with the builder, then like, for example, like if you have downtime with the builder, right? Or like there's some like network latency that's significant enough where like impacts the builder on a low block time blockchain, like a very small block time blockchain, then you're going to be impacted in terms of how many of your searcher transactions are included.
Just purely.
If like the block time of the blockchain is like less than a second, you're going to get killed.
And the auction mechanisms wouldn't help. Despite the fact that you.
I mean, at a certain point as a builder, you have to decide this is as many transactions as I'm going to include in my auction. Right, because I need to be able to submit my block to the proposers. But in a longer block time blockchain, latency is not significant.
Yeah.
Specifically looking at latency in terms of low block time blockchains, it has impact.
I think there are two nuances that are being missed. One is for Ethereum, it doesn't actually really matter if you're co-located to a validator.
Because of the block
seconds,
time,
like,
yeah.
More than enough. And like additional 60 milliseconds in network latency is likely not gonna, like, you might eke out 0.5% of inclusion or whatever, but that's probably not the reason why you're missing bundles. I also think co-locating near a validator to see a mempool is not all of it. Ideally, you want to be co-located next to validators and full nodes that you have identified to be owned by RPC providers like Ethereum, because those are where the order flow that.
So you're getting it from both. So like the full node though is propagating to the validator as well. Yeah.
So
Okay.
something that people have done on Arbitrum, I've seen, is they have super stripped down light clients that are only connected to the sequencer and specific node that they have identified to come out of Ethereum or
That makes sense.
so they don't pair with any other nodes that are just like random people nodes.
So it's very parasitic.
And then they like rent 300 IP addresses and then instantiate 300 instances of the same light client on the same machine so that they basically take up all the connections to that whole node and most of it to the sequencer.
But then don't they reset their peers like every certain amount of days?
It depends on the client. I think on Avalanche, you should never turn off your node because once you disconnect it, you'll never connect back to that node again. Because there's like a constant,
Number of people that are just sitting there waiting.
I don't know if that's the case. But
Yeah.
Generally, more nodes are better than this, cost effective. But
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think you see this as well within Flashbots in that like there's like tiers of searchers. Like Flashbots has like searchers where they will always accept their bundles, and others like you need to have a certain amount of reputation so that they know you're not DOSing the Flashbot system. So yeah. like being in the place where the sequencing of transactions as well as the order flow is coming from is where you make money. So yeah, it all comes down to networks at the end of the day. Awesome. So, however, as you can see, Flashbots and MEV Boost are far from the perfect state. There's a lot of nuance to it and a lot of issues that currently exist within it. So one part of it is Tornado Cash censorship. Censorship at the base layer of Tornado Cash transactions is now very common due to, as I mentioned earlier, the US Department of Treasury banning the use of Tornado Cash by US residents. So I hope no one in this room, I know no one in this room has used Tornado Cash ever. So hopefully that's such an information.
Yeah.
That means that you need to send it first, actually. So yes. So as we saw in this earlier slide, because the share of the block building is almost 80% run by Flashbots, the amount of OFAC compliant blocks is significantly higher than the number of non-OFAC compliant blocks. Flashbot sensors, as well as Blockstreet ethical and Blockstreet regulated, I believe. Yes.
Do you happen to know if, like, from the Flashbots that has talked to lawyers or are you saying?
Oh, they talked to a bunch of lawyers. Have to that.
Not lawyers, but actual.
Oh yeah, definitely. I would be very surprised if any large organization at that scale has not talked to some representative in government, or has not been reached out to by some representative in government having to talk to them. So yeah.
Why hasn't there been someone that's like, this is like for quote unquote Flashbots, but they provide outlets which are like.
They do. That's what Blockstreet Max Profit is. That's what Manifold is. Like Flashbots open sourced their relay. So anyone can run a relay. They don't open source their builder though, I think.
Well, why would they want to?
Exactly. So yeah, they open source a relay, anyone can run a relay.
Do they actually extract? Well, Flashbots, is Flashbots not for profit?
I'm really, it's like a very gray area in my opinion.
Technically, they have no technical remedy.
Yeah. Wait, do they run a block builder? They don't run a block builder, or do they?
They run a relay and a block building.
Okay, then where do the profits in the block builder go?
That's the profit. That's my problem.
I want to say they don't run a block builder. I was reading somewhere that they don't. I'm not sure though. I'm not sure.
They have to. but
They don't have to.
Submit. for
Nope.
transactions to-
Other people can run builders.
But Flashbots does have a builder, that's why you can still submit bundles to like the same.
Yeah, yeah. I think so. I'm not sure. Like the organization of Flashbots is very interesting. So like it could be like like this is not run by Flashbots, but like still it's run somewhere, in that realm of
Oh,
influence.
is that why that guy left?
Yeah, I think it's also the censorship. Like one of the main founders of Flashbots left recently, Stefan. Yeah, because of the censorship at the base layer, which he was very concerned about. So yeah. So the other cool example, this meme is good. Hopefully Manifold doesn't see this. So basically, one of the failures of MEV Boost was seen here, which is, as I mentioned earlier, if your relay is incorrectly configured, then because proposers are blindly trusting your relay that they're connected to, they're going to accept your blocks that have high bids, even if they don't actually have those bids within it. So there's a lot of onus on relays to be accepting the right blocks from block builders, because there's like for every single relay, there's like a bunch of block builders that connect to it. Like any of us can run a block builder, right? So there's like a market competition of block builders and a market competition of searchers that are all submitting to relays, and only one block gets through. So yeah.
Really important question. Did you actually make them? Or just,
Oh no, this was from Phil. Stop. I'm like not gonna like stop. I mean, it's a good meme. It's a good meme. It's a good meme. But yeah, basically like Flashbots open source their relay, and so like all these other teams are like basically taking their relay and then implementing them. And this guy Manifold is like a really just funny dude on Twitter, and that like he just like shits on Flashbots a lot, but then like Flashbots shit on him a lot when he like fucked up the relay. So yeah, it's pretty funny. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to curse on this, but it's okay. Yeah, too late now. Okay, so order flow centralization. So another interesting component of this is that builders are heavily incentivized to have order flow agreements, private order flow agreements. What that means is for example, I'm going to talk to SushiSwap, and SushiSwap will send me all of their transactions. Every single transaction originating from SushiSwap is in a private order flow agreement with Manifold. I'm not sure how public that information is, but sure, like, yeah. Basically, like, there are examples of private order flow, and so like, the only reason why that exists is that like, Manifold needs to guarantee that they're going to win blocks, because otherwise there's no point in them running a builder. How do they do that? They do that by paying a protocol to submit transactions to them. And this gives incentive to protocols now making money from the block creation process, as well as block builders now being able to compete. However, what you can imagine is when a specific block builder has a monopoly, say if Flashbots wanted to do this, they would just kill everyone. Because if Flashbots has order flow agreements where they say only submit to us, don't submit to anyone else, then they would kill everyone else in the market because 80% of their blocks are getting included. So not only are these protocols now getting better UX, but they're also getting inclusion, and Flashbots is getting paid for it. The only reason why this hasn't happened is that Flashbots is like a decentralized collective that refuses to do so in the benefit of Ethereum. They don't have any private order flow agreements. No, you can, so like there's some nuance to it. There's like a specific system within it. I'm a bit iffy on the construction of it. Basically, you can submit to a specific builder as a protocol. Like there are ways to do it. So yeah. Basically, there's some solutions to it. We can dive into this a little bit later, but basically, like what you can imagine is in the earlier slide when we talk about privileged parties, a lot of research has gone into over the past 6 months how exactly users and protocols can take advantage of the MEV in the system, as in how do users take control of their order flow, which is generating all the MEV in the system, and actually extract value from it. And secondly, how do protocols design more MEV resistant systems, or ones that distribute MEV towards the users of the protocol? So a lot of cool research around this. Order flow auctions are one. Basically, I'm going to auction off to this set of builders, pay me for my transaction, and I'll submit my transaction to you. And the second is this idea of like a fee escalator. I think it's really cool, the concept of like time price trade-offs. Basically, as you can see in this chart, if you accept my transaction right now, I want to get paid $1,000 because I can't accurately value my transaction. But if it doesn't get accepted over a period of time, I'm willing to pay you for my transaction to get accepted as a user. Does that make sense to everybody? Like what a fee escalator is in that situation? Basically, in the early stages, I want to get paid, but if no one else includes it, I still want my transaction to get included, so I'll pay you to include it. I'll pay the block builder more money. Does that make sense? Should I see a little diagram in the bottom line? Sure. So does the order flow auction make sense here? Basically, I'm going to auction off my order flow to any builder. I take bids from a bunch of builders and say, okay, like, you know,
It's sushi auctions up there.
no, not sushi. You are a user.
Oh.
You auction off your intent to do something in your store. And then a builder pays you for that intent. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Basically auctioning off just yourself.
My order flow, yes.
Oh.
So the order flow auction is for searchers asking builders to pay.
It can be, you know, specifically looking from the point of view of users.
Yeah. And then what's the fee escalator?
You can think about it as like something that gets incorporated inside of the transaction, and that I'm going to submit some kind of like a curve, right? That represents my time price trade-off. TUMs, like time weighted AMMs, explore this a little bit, but basically, I don't really care where my transaction gets executed in the next 12 hours. I just want to buy $1,000 worth of something, right? I'm pretty price insensitive. Like I can assume the price will stay relatively constant. My order is not large enough to impact the market. I just want my transaction to get included, right? So what I'm going to say is, if I don't know exactly how to value my transaction, so I'm going to create some kind of like a curve that values my transaction with a time price trade-off. As in, I will pay you, or I want to get paid right now if I incorrectly value it, right? For you to include it. Because what that means is if you're willing to pay me $1,000, you must be getting more than $1,000 out of it.
All right.
Right? Whereas later on, if I don't have enough value inside of my transaction, I'm willing to pay you $1,000 to include my transaction because I still want it to get included over time. But that means that I've incorrectly priced my transaction.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make sense? So I'm escalating the fee that I pay over time because I still want my transaction to get included.
Right.
Yes.
Background,
Background what?
background.
No.
It's an RPC that a searcher created where if a user uses this RPC to submit their order, they will refund you 50% of the background.
Oh, that's kind of funny.
And guys shut it down, never used it.
Why?
I think users just don't give a shit. Like.
Too much of a pain in the ass to, yeah,
It's like, Blockcraft also offers this service now.
Blockstrat, one of the relays and builders. Yeah.
So if you go and like buy $1,000 worth of Bitcoin, rather than submitting it through the MetaMask RPC by default, if you add their RPC, they will submit it through Flashbots. And if there exists some sort of background opportunity, they will refund you 50% of the profit. Sort of like a rebate on your pricing back or whatever.
So searchers, extremely competitive market. Builders, on the other hand, launch it and people actually use it. So a lot of difference in terms of the privilege within the system. Awesome. Any questions on this kind of overview of deeper overview of MEV and like Flashbots? MEV boost makes sense to everybody? Yes, go ahead.
I don't understand how the conversation about order flow options and the escalators is related to decentralization, because that's just happening on the builder side, not the builder side. And the reason we want this is we anticipate wanting a very centralized service or operation. We want to keep proposers decentralized. So how does?
Wait, no, we want to keep builders decentralized, not proposers. Proposers are validators.
Yes, we want the proposers.
You can assume proposers are decentralized in the system already. We're concerned about the decentralization of builders in MEV. Ethereum is the network.
This is to have, you anticipate some centralization, but you want to maintain it, some sense of decentralization as well. So it's
In the
not
builders.
one big like entity.
I don't want one big builder from getting all the order flow of everybody.
Okay.
As in that builder is paying everyone for their order flow, thereby creating all the blocks in Ethereum. That's what I don't want.
It's like you anticipate centralization, but you want to keep it decentralized.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the way that we do that is by adding redistribution of MEV at every single stage of that process before it gets to the builder level, as well as decentralizing the builder, which we'll get into later. Does that make sense though?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
So what is Flashbot?
What is Flashbots?
Yeah.
Efficient markets, a decentralized collective solving efficient markets for MEV.
And this is more recent, so the general reason that Flashbots is for the idea of how this we're lowering the cost of the dollar, right? And requiring you all that confident in yourself.
The idea being that by reducing information asymmetry and architecture, like resource asymmetry in the validator market via Flashbots, we're able to have a more aligned and efficient system. Does that make sense? Awesome. Any other questions on Flashbots? Okay. Awesome. Okay. These next sections are a little bit more short than the first ones. I know the first one's a bit heavy. So yeah, basically proposal builder separation, as you mentioned earlier, is splitting the block construction role from the block proposal role. Essentially, this prevents proposers from getting paid in the system, right? We want to prevent order flow with validators as well. The way that we do that is by pinning it all on the builders, right? We want to be able to simplify the market down to what exactly we need to optimize for. PBS allows for a separation of roles that makes that a lot easier. It's a lot easier to construct markets when the incentives are a single group of a single party that has similar incentives. Does that make sense? Why PBS is helpful for MEV? Awesome. So it helps prevent exclusive order flow in the system, and you want to prevent the strong centralizing pressure of the power that proposers have. Awesome. So decentralizing builders, this is a bit of a light section because there's more information coming out this soon, but basically a high level overview is that for right now, right, builders are centralized. There's one specific party that's running a builder. For example, Sid and Manav and Andrew can all run builders, right? You guys are all submitting to the same relay. Instead, what we can do is we can smooth out the amount of resources you guys are getting. Like, for example, would you guys rather have to compete between each other, right? It's like a Nash equilibrium situation, right? would you guys rather want to compete between each other where for every single block, you guys are competing over 0.2 ETH, or know that every single block you guys are getting 0.07 ETH? Because you're getting that extra 0.01 ETH overall because you guys aren't competing between each other.
Right.
Instead, you're working together to create the best blocks. And so you expand this out to a greater system, and that a decentralized builder, what it is that every single person in this room is running their own builder, right? But for every single block, we randomly select 3 builders out of all of you guys to construct the block together,
Got it.
right? You guys hold each other accountable, and then you guys are the ones who submit the block to the proposer, eliminating the incentives of private order flow. Because if you have a specific private order flow agreement, you guys can all decide to cut them out. And the value of the transactions that everyone else is receiving will always be out the private order flow in most cases. Does that make sense?
Can you go ahead one slide? Like,
Sure.
how does PBS actually achieve that? Like,
How does PBS achieve the, so basically right now, proposers still, if they want to, have the ability to select block contents as well as validate the blocks, right? Like I don't have to run any of this middleware. I can just run my own, local mempool, some of my own transactions.
Right.
So if a large enough validator did that, say Coinbase is running their own validator, right? And they're the ones who are doing the block building, they can still have a bunch of order flow agreements because they have the ability to select block contents as well as be the final stage of which blocks get proposed. They control the whole process. And so you want to separate this idea of broadcasting blocks from the people that are building the blocks, such that you can focus on incentive aligning just the builders.
Yeah, but not the builders have the private order.
Sure, but it's much easier to figure out how to focus on a party that is not actually proposing the blocks, is aligned in the construction of the blocks, than it is to focus on figuring out how to ensure the incentive element of a party that is both constructing and proposing the block. By separating the two, you make your life a lot easier and incentive aligning just the builder party.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what a decentralized builder looks like. Suave is the code word for the new project that Flashbots is putting out. Hopefully in the next week or so, that is working on this decentralized builder as well as MEV across rollups. So how is Ethereum more censorship resistant with PBS? As Dan mentioned earlier, there's this thing called CR lists. These are the censorship resistant lists proposed by Vitalik. It forces inclusion of specific transactions. So like these are transactions that like, I'm not exactly sure the construction of this, but the idea is that like in any block that you create, you need to include specific transactions. So it's like this idea that like you wouldn't be able to censor people out of the system. The second is threshold decryption. How many of you guys are familiar with threshold decryption or have heard the term before? By raising hands. Okay. Brian, what is threshold decryption?
Basically, you can have all your transactions in the mempool like encrypted until like 2/3 of the validators accept the block or accept the transaction to the block. So that way, like no one can really do it, like tell them to see their transaction.
Okay, perfect. So what's up, Dan?
Why is this like, why hasn't this been
How do you decide which transactions are the ones that are censorship resistant in a network? Like that's just a difficult problem to solve. It's very hard to agree like on the threshold decryption part or the CR list part. Oh, that
Why don't we just have?
I'll get into that right now. So basically, like as Brian mentioned, you're specifically talking about like a BFT system, like a Byzantine fault tolerance system, where you need 2/3 of validators to agree upon the generating the threshold decryption key from their own distributed keys that then are able to decrypt the encrypted transactions inside of the block.
Yeah.
Does that make sense for everybody? Like what exactly like threshold decryption is? It's the idea that you can't decrypt until you're sure that the block is finalized. So Ethereum right now does not have single slot finality. So like we've talked about this a little bit earlier, but basically like there's this idea of like epochs within Ethereum. Epochs consist of 32 slots, right? Right now in Ethereum, there's not single slot finality. So within epochs, for each of the 32 slots within epoch, 1/32 of validators are agreeing upon what the block for that slot is. However, I believe you don't have single slot finality right now. Yes, on Ethereum. And so what that means is there's an incentive for, say, the next 1/32 of validators to get the first, so like in the first slot, you decrypt. We see that, say, like Peter has the intent to buy $1 million worth of ETH. that's going to dramatically shift the price of the market. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, like I want to see if there's any intent to do anything crazy. And then because I know that you need to do that, you need to get that transaction through, I have incentive to decrypt and then not include a transaction, and then include a transaction that front runs you in another block. So you only really are able to do a threshold decryption system when there's not ability to be able to not include a transaction after it's been decrypted. Because as soon as the intent has been signaled, you remove the purpose of the encryption. Does that make sense? So if I have the ability to exclude a transaction after I've decrypted it, which works in a non-BFT system, then there is that threshold decryption doesn't have as much value, if any. That's the issue though. There's not single stop finality. So I can decrypt and then not include. Because that next set of validators could be like, oh, well, I didn't see it. Right. I don't know. Doesn't exist. Yeah. Right. And then what you could do is you could just front run the shit out of Peter. Right. And then you screwed.
Is that just because of Gasper consensus? And how?
I think so. But I mean, it's reliance, it's a problem with all non-BFT consensus, which is why like, and even within BFT consensus, threshold decryption hasn't been included because of issues that exist within, say, like, who is going to encrypt that transaction? Are you going to assume that every single user is going to encrypt the transaction? Right. Is it the RPC you're submitting through? Well, then the RPC has all the power, right? Because they know what all the order flow is. So if someone, say, like gets access to the RPC, someone inside the RPC is like, for example, like every single transaction on Cosmos mostly runs through Kepler. Right. So if Kepler is like, hey, these are threshold, they're encrypted transactions, but I know what all of them are before I encrypt them. Yeah. They control the volume system.
There's actually a lot of people working on regular decryption at the consensus layer.
Interesting.
Just like general. I haven't.
Is this step and goes at Anoma?
No, this is someone from Chain.
Interesting. Yeah, privacy preserved.
Seeing it in like the emails, like so I assumed it was already.
I don't know. I think that like no system really has been implemented until a significant amount of value has gone through it. So like you don't know if threshold decryption is valid until you have like enough people trying to break it such that like you can get access to the intent of transactions before. Also, pricing transactions with threshold decryption is a bit tough too.
It's impossible.
Yeah, exactly.
And isn't that also very market efficient?
Yep, exactly.
It breaks all on the
Exactly.
all next.
Yeah. Because you're essentially like removing the point of like this MEV. Because like if I'm trying to do like liquidation and I'm like, hey, like I want you to encrypted bundle my Oracle update with this like liquidation that I'm doing, but I'm doing it in an encrypted manner. What is the efficiency on it? Like, how do I know which resources are being used by specific transactions? It breaks the whole point of like the MEV system.
It also just goes back to like the information asymmetry that already happens.
Yep. So it's less of a question of even can you do threshold decryption? Do you even want to do threshold decryption?
It's like if you're like a centralized player and you have access to like other like big players, right? If you have more capital, better infrastructure, or whatever, you can just it's just like ends up like multiply it. The rich get richer. It's like let's say you're like some right? And you have access to like different clients that like want to get like you just talk to them, you submit your transactions all encrypted, no one can front run, no one can back run, they don't know what's in the transaction. Oh, right, which is just the same as what we have like Citadel and right.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, and then the next thing I want to mention real quick is MEV Plus. There's something called Eigenlayer, which does like have to show it a little bit, basically there's this concept called like there's this concept called restaking, which basically means like you can take the ETH that you've already staked and restake it for like other like functions or like other things on Ethereum. So one proposed thing to do is to use this restaking for relays in the system as well as validators. Basically like for validators in the system, and that like validators are not allowed to get a block and then not submit it. You can get slashed for that. So what you do is, in order to access the relays within say like a Flashbot system, you need to restake your ETH such that if you do not accept
Yeah.
the block that was proposed by the relay, then you get slashed.
How is that economically secure in the sense that you could have like some trade that you're making that are worth more than how much you're staking? And it just doesn't matter that much.
Trades, yeah, sure.
Right, yeah. So what's the point of restaking?
Well, then that just changes how much you're gonna stake.
Like right now, you're not saying any.
I see what you mean. It's like,
It's just like. it's just
okay,
like
there's
taking a small-
there's more nuance to it than just like the staking part. That's a very bare bones. We can dive into more about MEVs plus later, but like there's also other ways to do it in terms of like there is a really good ETH research. Also, if you guys do not have ETH research accounts, I highly recommend getting ETH research accounts. It's like the forum for like Ethereum research. There's like this whole conversation on Pepsi, which is proposer enabled I'm forgetting what the other P is. Proposer enabled proposed commitments, like something like that, basically, meaning that like with signatures, you can guarantee that someone's able to receive blocks and only decrypt them after that. So for example, you are only able to decrypt this encrypted block that I sent you as a relay if you sign off on it. And that signature is included with the block. So if you include any transactions from that bundle or from that block that I've transmitted you via the relay, then you've broken that commitment.
This is kind of just like, like, is that not just happening at the network cost level? Like, how would you enforce that? Oh, this person signed my transaction.
Yeah, it's gossip. Yeah.
So that you just like blacklist them on your like, own local view.
What do you mean?
Like, if someone says, oh, I'm gonna clear your transaction, but they just don't.
You only send them the block after they've signed that they've like I prompt, like I received this message from you.
So like, you can send them the block, but they still don't have to include it.
And what if they don't?
Yeah, they can just say, screw you, I'm not gonna include it. Like, I signed off on it, but like, I'm not gonna include it. Like, there's nothing stopping them. Like,
No, because let me think about this. I think there was some slashing condition that comes with it. Might not be slashing.
that would have that sense there.
I will look into this one more time.
Yeah.
I believe though it's like you're only able to decrypt the block with like some commitment that you send. I have to look at it one more time. But yeah, okay. So that's censorship resistance and PBS. Any questions on this?
The holders are forced to take the block with the highest.
They want that.
Yeah.
But they're not obligated.
No.
They're not.
No.
But
You could just be like, I didn't receive it.
you get slashed if you don't. Is that-
And- Yeah. Because you like don't want to get blacklisted, I guess. I'm not sure. I have to check that too. Awesome. Any other questions on MEV and PBS? Like two or three. MEV and L2s. So as Carol mentioned earlier, there is MEV and L2s, a lot of MEV and L2s. So this is something from I stole this one too. This is from this guy named XSY Sun. I think it's Sexy Sun, but I'm not sure what that would stand for. So basically like what this diagram shows is MEV so far has been like very explosive, right? You're looking at like a crazy amount of growth from atomic MEV on an L1. However, with this idea of cross-domain MEV, as in doing MEV, say, across L2s, across app chains, across many different environments, there's just going to be this idea of the super linear accumulation of MEV, right? Of order flow based MEV, meaning that it's going to be very important to determine how exactly MEV gets extracted in a system where there's multiple domains and more sophisticated architectures required to extract value from those systems. Yes.
What is the reasoning behind having that like this and not like some of those like a signal?
Because of the fact that it might be like a, like you have like these burst periods that then taper off.
Yeah.
Right now, when we're looking at our view of this time scale, I'm only looking at to the point where we see the explosion of MEV across L2s, but this might taper off at some point as well. I think you'll see explosions in certain periods as new opportunities, say, across domains get explored.
Yeah.
For example, like, but obviously like those explosions are lesser in magnitude over time.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is like a high level frame for this. Basically, as we talked about earlier as well, Sequencers are more sophisticated. You can do more crazy things with them. You can centralize MEV capture into roll-up sequencers by separating transaction ordering and execution, such as via an MEV auction. You can internalize MEV to app chains and other domains. We'll talk later about cross-chain MEV systems, but that's very brief for now. So MEV and L2s, basically more sophisticated systems, more domains means more MEV. Sound good? Yes? Sequencers privileged parties within the system. Sequencers are a privileged party. There's other privileged parties in the system as well. Say, for example, you decentralize your sequencer, you now have like something similar to a validator.
Has there been examples of L1 fake value transactions? Like L1 forcing L2s to hire?
Yes. So a good example of this, it's not really L1s and L2s. The way I think about it is more of in the analogy of like producer chains and consumer chains. This is a big thing within Cosmos. Like basically, like you have chains that are providing security. If you're using my security, you must give me some share of the profits on your chain. So, how many of you guys are familiar with like interchain security on Cosmos? Anyone else? No? Okay. So interchain security and restaking are very similar. The idea being that I'll do this very briefly. Basically, like validators are heterogeneous in terms of the resources that they have. Right? You can assume that every single validator does not have the same resources. Some validators are going to run nodes across multiple chains. Yes, because they have additional resources. I'm going to be a validator on Ethereum, Avalanche, and Evmos because I have the resources to do it. However, Ethereum knows this. And so what they're going to say is, I'm going to make your life easier. I don't want you to have to go out there and figure out how to run those validators. I'm going to bring opportunities to you. And as a result of that, Evmos or Avalanche is going to pay me for doing so. So that's this idea of producer and consumer chains. Producer chains are the ones that have the security. By giving the security of their validators, they receive revenue. This is taking the revenue from other domains and bringing it into your main domain. Does that make sense? Exactly. You pay rent for security.
You briefly dive into interchain versus
Interchain specifically focuses on this idea of producer and consumer chains. So the example that I mentioned earlier, I don't have security. I want to give security to someone else. They're going to pay me for that security. Mesh is a bit more interesting in that like you have chains that are capable of being producers in their own way, but by cross-validating with one another, essentially like sharing validators in some form, we tie ourselves together.
Is this to solve the idea that's hard to bootstrap a validator? So
Is this to solve the idea? No, it's to harden it's like instead of every single Cosmos chain being susceptible to attack, like a 51% attack because all their validatings, all of their holdings are somewhat small. For example, like Osmosis has like what, like $1 billion, say like in stake, right? And then like Evmos is like 300 million, and then like Juno has like 200 million. Evmos and Juno want additional security, and there's similar validators to Osmosis. Mesh security is the idea that like you need to attack all of the network's combined value to prevent it. There's obviously some like proportion less than the 1.5 billion total number, but it's still more security than each individual chain has. That's more of the interchain security part of it, like sharing security.
Yeah.
Because these mesh security is the idea that you already have like some like big validators. So awesome. Okay, so MEV redistribution. Basically, this will be like last two sections. Yeah. As in, I validate it for another chain. Like my validator says kind of how does that give security to the second chain? Because you need to attack the validator set of the producer chain in order to get control of the consumer chain. You need to take control of the place where the blocks are being produced in order to take control of the consumer chain.
Like 7 and 1
or not.
Does that kind of make sense or no?
So like, this is good. Like validators, like, but it's been bad on like this second chain.
Sure.
My stable in the second chain is slosh.
Sure.
So are you saying information security, if you do something bad in the consumer chain, then slosh the producer chain is stable?
Yep. Yeah. But not necessarily all of it. This is where like nuance comes into it, right? Is like you can decide that like, okay, producers on this chain are only able to allocate 25% of their stake towards interchain security opportunities. What that means is that I can only lose 25% of my stake from consumer chain like slashing events, right, on the producer chain. So the bridge chain is able to protect themselves, but also like maintain some semblance of security. So in that case, they'd be giving 25% of security at max to the consumer chain.
So, I guess there's only, like, you can only have version security or like,
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense. Yeah. As a consumer chain,
Yeah.
Okay, what, but like, that's like, mesh is like a very soft concept in my head. Like that, I like, it's basically just like, I see it as like sharing some form of security across chains. I'm not as sure about the mechanism behind it. Yeah. Interchain security is much more formalized than mesh. Mesh is like the idea that you share security. So I'm not sure, in all honesty, about mesh.
Why is there?
No, I was just saying it's an arbitrary example.
What
Why would you want to do that? Because,
are those?
well, you're not really giving full interchain security then to the other chain. What are the vulnerabilities? Why I would only want to give 25% of stake towards the consumer chain?
Yeah.
Because I don't want some like shit to go down on the consumer chain and then every single one of my producers get fucked too.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care enough about the consumer chain as a producer chain to screw my own chain over, right? I just want like a bad, like if one validator, right, messes up, I'm fine. But if a bunch of my validators get slashed, like then it's bad for my chain too. Like you don't want like the crazy explosive effects that can potentially attack it, which is why people are also like anti-eigenlayer in some forms too, because it can break the incentive alignment of validators on Ethereum. Yeah. So yeah, awesome. Makes sense? Yes, interchain security. Awesome. Okay, so MEV smoothing. Basically, as you mentioned earlier, you guys would want to combine together as validators as well now in order to share your opportunities. Because right now, for example, there's some set of builders that are proposing to you guys, you three right here. You guys are 3 validators now. And what that means is that you guys are getting heterogeneous rewards, right? What you want to do is you guys don't really want heterogeneous rewards, right? Because that heterogeneous reward could go to someone else. So instead, you guys combine into a staking pool and you say, okay, any rewards we get get distributed equally among us. So that's MEV smoothing in some forms. So there's some benefits that happen with better censorship resistance in the short term to that. And that like validators are less incentivized pre-PBS to have exclusive order flow agreements from that. So MEV smoothing is a cool thing as well that can happen within it. There's some constraints that come with that, but that can be talked about later as well. Awesome. Okay, this is something that's actually really cool. How many of you guys are familiar with the osmosis and skip proposal? Okay. Andrew, what is the osmosis and skip proposal?
Wait, osmosis. Isn't skip just like Flashbots for osmosis?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know what like the osmosis and skip is.
Okay.
It's similar to what they originally were, so only like now that we kind of like osmosis like sharing the MEV that like now we like it like spam of what like spot out and that gives like an MEV. But they're like going to put it out.
Okay.
But now like osmosis and acting can actually get some of that.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of is, yeah, that makes sense. The idea being here that like in that previous example, right? What the osmosis and skip proposal is, osmosis, for you guys who aren't familiar, is a DEX chain on Cosmos. What is cool about it is that they can do arbitrary actions before the end of their block, as well as before and I believe after the beginning of their block. They have full control over the block construction. So before any other validator includes a transaction, the chain itself can force their validators to run a specific set of code that does a specific action on that DEX. So they can guarantee that before and after any transactions that get included, that validators are forced to run a certain thing in order to be active on this network. And so what that means is Skip proposed an opportunity where they would do end block arbitrage after every single transaction on Osmosis. Internal arbitrage within Osmosis, meaning that any of the value that was previously going to arbitrage bots now goes towards Osmosis token holders. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Sid, Sean.
Is this not exactly what we wanted to do in our consulting project?
Yeah.
Yeah. NDA. Sean.
This implies that Skip is going to find optimal solutions.
Yeah, Bellman Ford or Convex.
Across,
The convex solver takes a period of time, like a long period of time though, but like they were able to get down like the Bellman Ford solver to like less than a millisecond.
this is across like DEX and.
Is this open source?
I don't think so.
Well, how would this work if it's not open source? I mean, validated.
Oh, it would be open source whenever they release it. I'm not sure it's open source right now.
Oh,
Yeah.
It's across like all DEXs and.
It sounds like you're about to rip that Bellman Ford algorithm, Sean.
no idea what you're talking about.
Go for it.
Across all DEXs and DEXs and just like, and one arbitrage across, just to make sure it's the same price.
Internally to
And
osmosis.
then it'll redistribute the end user outputs.
It'll send it to a address that anyone can claim from based on their osmosis token. Yes.
And is this specific to like Cosmos app change at the end of the can do it on the end?
Oh,
I'm not able to get to it.
Ethereum, you can't do it. Rollups though are an interesting
Yeah,
case study of
that's
this. I'm not sure. That's something I'm looking at a little bit more too. I believe it depends on how you construct these things, right? It depends like, what is your state machine?
Like,
What
let's say
is the permissions of it? Yeah. But depending on how you construct your domain, potentially, yes. So they're able to force every single transaction that interacts with the DEX to run en bloc arbitrage, which is crazy, right? Because that completely turns this idea of an efficient searcher market on its head. However, it doesn't really scale well when you talk about like tens of thousands of transactions happening within every like 5 seconds. But it works when you only have like a couple hundred.
You can still have like sandwiching effects and stuff happen. You didn't block, right?
How would sandwiching work in this case?
You would bump up the price within the block to start off. And then whatever transaction, and then back right to get your profit, and at the end of the block, it's still like considered to be.
Okay, if you front run and there's an imbalance internally. Actually, let me think about this.
But validators can still send.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Validators can still. How would sandwiching work in this case? Like, wouldn't you be able to back, like, if there was some loop that was available, like, if you front run to a certain degree?
Sandwiches generally happen on thinking that, or like, they're using one tool for,
Sure.
so there aren't backward opportunities, and so even if there are, validators can just do it into the block.
I also think though that like Osmosis said they would slash for any front run and sandwich, which also is a component of app chains that they can do more at a more minute level than Ethereum can do. Because it's very hard for, say, like however many crazy number of transactions are on Ethereum to be validated to check, okay, is this a sandwich? Is this a front run? And even with Osmosis, they're still not able to really detect if something is like a front run or not, right?
It's also an assumption that if you were swapped, the curve is smooth, so then you can like move people all together, you get something else on the other way. But if you have some like weird curves that have like.
It's a bit more weird, but you can still sandwich someone even if it's not a smooth curve, because like there's still some distribution of liquidity, right? And as long as you can approximate that, like, and simulate that, like what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate that locally, and then I'll do the front run, or I'll do the sandwich.
But then if you were doing that on cheap-ish, would that be pretty expensive?
Would that be pretty expensive for us?
For
For what?
to like,
Oh, it is.
like,
Oh, yes. So it's very easy for arbitrage on it's easy because it's balancer pools. It's a lot harder to do en bloc arbitrage with concentrated liquidity. It's like fucking difficult. Like, it is so fucking difficult because you have no idea what the depth of liquidity is, which is why like dynamic, even like routing on a DEX that's concentrated liquidity at the point of transaction execution is so fucking difficult. Because you have no idea what liquidity is. Whereas in an XYK curve, it's so easy. Like, or even a stable swap, it's so easy because you literally just plug in some fucking numbers, you get an output, and you're like, wow, I have an arbitrage opportunity. It's an O1 operation. But if it's like, if you have no idea what the number of ticks is, you're now reliant on the number of ticks of liquidity. You have to loop through all of them, figure out like what the depth of liquidity is, then you have to do the arbitrage based off of that, then go back the other way. So yeah. No, but that, if you're talking about the privileged execution that Skip has, no, because no one else will be able to execute on the state. The issue is though, you're going through so much state that's an issue. For you.
And then if you have, let's say, like overflow number of transactions including one block, is there a way to drive them to include?
Oh yeah, you just pay more to the proposer. Are you talking about in the Osmosis case?
Yeah.
In a first come, first serve order pool, mempool, no, but also like it's first come, first serve in practice, in theory, not in practice, right? Because like you can just like arbitrarily censor people if you want to, right? I just didn't receive your transaction. Not gonna put it.
When we talk about the sandwiching thing, you mentioned that values can do it, why can't searchers do it?
Why can't searchers do it?
Like,
Because,
flash jack up the price.
sure.
Transaction.
You just said flash lens jack up the price. You need to recreate the flash lens in the same transaction.
Oh, in the same, okay, that makes sense.
Why not search the same thing model?
Builders can actually technically offer inter-transaction flash loans now.
Yeah.
What they do, but everybody does.
And then like,
Second question.
second part was, you mentioned it's like difficult to go through state.
For concentrated liquidity arbitrage,
The state of the DEX or the state of the chain?
the DEX.
No.
Because say, for example, you want to run end block arbitrage on a concentrated liquidity DEX. How do you determine like where to like? It's just like with an XYK curve, it's so easy because it's like you can estimate how much changing liquid, like what your end price is after executing some leg of the arbitrage. Whereas in concentrated liquidity, you're obligated to go through the ticks.
Yeah.
So what you can do is to force the chain to like, say, for example, not include that many transactions is deploy a bunch of ghost ticks that have like a very minimal amount of liquidity and then force an iteration over, say, 1 million ghost ticks.
Yeah.
Instead of an O1 operation, you now have something that has a million operations. So concentrated liquidity breaks down a lot of this stuff. So it's very hard, not fun. Awesome. Okay. Any questions on MEV redistribution? Makes sense, like how it's cool, how it can have its impacts, how you can redistribute to different parties. Yes.
Yeah.
Privacy is also a big part of that too. Awesome. Future of MEV, last section. So what is the future of MEV? This is my opinion. Obviously, I think this is where things trend. They could trend differently. I think likely what will end up happening is users will have more control, right? Users are where all the order flow generates from. So it only likely makes sense that users are also compensated for this. Wallets will also take control. You'll see, I think wallets get more active in this. A cool example of this that I think is very interesting is Uniswap. Kind of an open secret is that they're going to be launching a wallet soon. And so what a really cool thing they could do is if they own the whole process, they own the DEX, they own the wallet, or they own the DEX, they own the wallet. What they can do is they can run their own builder. Every single Uniswap transaction has to go through their builder. Their builder will win every single block. Because think about how much value Uniswap does compared to all the other transactions on Ethereum. The issue is that really an unbiased system? Will Uniswap do it? I think likely not, because it goes against their ethos, but it does show you what's available for teams that are a bit more cutthroat than Uniswap when it comes to it. So you will see more verticalization of opportunities unless there's a really effective push towards decentralized builders. However, if decentralized builders do succeed, it can reduce the impact of EOF. But if people are verticalized, then it makes it a lot more difficult for those decentralized builders to compete. The second is threshold decryption, which is encrypted transactions. Likely, some proposals have shown that you can essentially separate blocks in different components. Ones that are built by the builders, CR-less, say the censorship resistant transactions, or the transactions which are not supposed to be censored, which is the CR-less that we talked about earlier, as well as an encrypted transactions proportion of a block. Builders can force a block template, which is the way that you want to construct the block, to look like that. You can have, say, like the CR list, which is the censorship resistant transactions, the encrypted transactions, and then the built block. And the last is like crazy privacy schemes around that. So talking about MEV markets a little bit more too, there's two cool things to touch on, which are one, cross-chain markets for MEV. Skip has been looking at this a little bit, but basically, how do you do atomic cross-chain MEV? So a cool example of this is, let me see, I'll pull out the chalkboard for a little bit. Basically, we have two chains, right? Some chain A, and some chain B, right? Chain A has a block that looks like this, right? And then it has another block like here. Chain B has a block, it's like in the middle, right? Yeah, looks like this, a little more skinny. So basically chain A, I'm a searcher, right? I want to do a two-leg arbitrage, but it's only possible if I atomically am able to execute transactions across these two different blockchains. These are assets that are only on these two other blockchains, right? So there's no global market price. This is the global market. So I'm doing an arbitrage. You can assume it's like not being impacted by any other market. I'm going to do a swap from asset 1 to asset 2 on this block. And then I want to guarantee that I can also do a swap from asset 2 to asset 1 on this block. But I don't want this first leg to execute unless the second leg executes. How do I do this? How do I guarantee that this executes only if I can guarantee this executes in the block?
I mean, either you have it in both. If there's some entity that like controls, so.
What is the entity that controls both?
Right now.
Right now, right, pre-Flashbots, you'd have to have the same validator on both chains offer the opportunity. So say that validator controls 10% of the stake on this chain and 5% of the stake on this chain. How many overlapping blocks exist across both chains in this case? Where the validator is likely to run both blocks on both chains, 0.5%. So now you're looking at reducing this opportunity only to 0.5% of blocks. You're not even able to, the validator is not even able to capture the value unless it happens in those 0.5% of blocks. It's a very inefficient system, right? Because validators know this opportunity exists and they want to capture it. So when you look at a system, say that has a decentralized builder, right? Validators are, you have PBS in both chains, right? So you have decentralized builders that are operating in both environments. So, and also, by the way, this number of 10% and 5% on one chain is ridiculous. And even in that case, they're still only able to offer the opportunity in 0.5% of cases. So an incredibly small amount. If you have a decentralized builder or validators opting into the system, we'll take the Flashbots example, right? 80% of all validators in Ethereum are running Flashbots, right? This chain will also have 80% as well. 64% of blocks are now going to be shared across both chains, right? You have some semblance that I know that like, okay, like I'm validating on both chains. This entity is validating on both chains at the same time. So given that it's the same entity validating on both chains, how do I guarantee that I get the swap from 1 to 2 and 2 to 1? Any ideas how you would do it?
I mean, you sort of like set a condition on Flashbots, right? Like, only if my thing in the second chain sort of goes through, will you run first one?
Sure. How do I incentivize the validator or the entity on chain B to include that transaction? I have to pay them, right? How do you price that? What are you pricing that against? Think about it, right? Like because right now, what I'm doing is say I submit the transaction here, right? At this point in the chain. This is when we can assume it's received by the validators on both sides of the chain, right? So here, there's still this portion of the block, which this entity is unaware of, right? I don't even know what transactions are coming in later on the block. But I need you to tell me by this point that I'm getting it. Because if you don't tell me by this point, well then how are we supposed to know that this transaction executes, right? So I need you to guarantee me by this point in the block that I'm getting the transaction on this side. So what now gets interesting is you're essentially pricing an option on placing first in the block. And then pricing that option gets very interesting as well. Because I'm buying this entity is now offering an option to be placed first for that resource in the block, right? But now you're looking at an extremely sophisticated entity that has to be now pricing options for placement in cross-chain MEV markets. Does that make sense? Yes.
Since the block size are kind of very good,
Sure.
how do you make sure, like, how do you know when the block or something is like block target or like, is it these timestamps or like, are you actually ensure that making guarantees about
That line.
what blocks being aligned into it?
It's less about the blocks, like the searcher is the one who will take the onus of that, is what you assume, right? The searcher will only submit this transaction knowing that the blocks are aligned in this way. Does that make sense? Like the searcher is responsible for saying, okay, like I know the blocks are aligned in this way. I need you to guarantee me on chain B that I'm going to get the first access to this resource. Does that make sense? So this is cross-chain MEV, like a simple example, right? Another interesting example is block space features, which are coming out soon. So how do I price block space 10 blocks out? And that is something that's also very interesting as well. Some cases that are like, say, like, I know there's like a fixed price update that happens 10 blocks from now on, say, like a betting market. I want to buy the block space to be the one who's going to arbitrage the opportunity 10 blocks out from now. Pricing that, though, is the fun part. How do you price the future on block space when you have no idea what other transactions are going to exist?
Yeah.
So I think likely what we'll see is that these are going to be very, what you see for this curve of pricing, say, the first access to a resource is looks something like this, right? Where there's some flat value where near the end of the block, right, they're pretty much able to price it, right? Like I know what the value of the transaction in this block are going to be, but early in the block, if you ask me, I need you to guarantee me the first person in this block in the next 100 milliseconds, it's a lot harder to price.
Right.
So yeah, it's a cool part of the system. And then block space features are cool as well. So that is basically like you have 10 blocks. And I want to buy the first spot in this block here.
Yeah.
So they have to be able to price opportunities in this one here, which will likely also look something like this. Does that make sense to everybody? Because if I have no idea what's coming out later on, how the hell am I supposed to price that block later on? Let's say, for example, volatility is low here. But I have no idea what the volatility is going to be here.
Yeah.
How the hell am I supposed to price this? But if I'm here, I know the volatility is not going to be that much greater than the next block, right? So then this can be a lower price. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. I think. Any other questions? Okay, that's pretty much it. Just have some resources here. For those of you who are interested, building a block builder or searcher is very fun. You can also get involved in doing MEV redistribution on DeFi protocols or other protocols as well. Good people to follow on Twitter. Oh, it's Bert, not Robert. Bert C. Miller, Phil Turin, and Sexy Son. And there's also a really good set of documentation by Flashbots at docs.flashbots.net/MEV. They didn't have a website until like a month ago. So you guys are very lucky in that they have a website now and it has an insane amount of resources. Honestly, probably, yeah. Oh, facts. My bad. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you guys for staying on.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Fiona.
Something like